This episode may contain content of a graphic nature, including descriptions of physical and sexual violence against adults, children, and animals. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, I'm Talia.
And I'm Tanya.
And together we are Crimes and Consequences, a true crime podcast. Hi, Tanya.
Hi, Talia.
Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting episode of Crimes and Consequences. The episode I have today, I'm going to let everyone know in advance, has to deal with child abuse. As many of you know, I don't normally like to do these stories, but this one, for some reason, it just felt like something that I needed to tell. This case was suggested to us by CG on Instagram from Mobile, Alabama, so I want to thank CG for the suggestion. Before I begin, if you guys haven't done so already, if you would take just one moment to hit the subscribe/follow button on whatever app you're listening to, it really helps us. Plus, you get weekly notifications.
And you want to know.
You want to know.
You want to know.
I need something to help remind me of everything in my life. So with that being said, again, I want to warn you, this story is about child abuse. So if that's a trigger for you, you probably don't want to listen to this episode. John DeBlase enjoyed a relatively normal upbringing in Mobile, Alabama. He was raised by two loving parents, Ann and Richard DeBlase. He attended public school, and he earned his high school diploma in 2003. After high school, he worked several jobs. He was always working. He was a hard worker. Sometimes he had two at one time. And he met a woman named Corinne Heathcock. The two began dating. One thing led to another, and it didn't take very long before Corinne discovered she was pregnant. On November 4th of 2005, Natalie DeBlase was born. Only 4 months later, the couple learned that Corinne was once again pregnant.
Damn.
I know. By the time John and Corinne were 20, they were married with their second child on the way. A little boy named Chase was born in December of 2006. So they have these two small children that are 13 months apart. As you can probably guess, the marriage was tumultuous. They didn't have any money. At that point, they didn't have any education, and they had these two small children.
Kids are stressful.
Extremely, especially a 13-month-old and a newborn. When you're 20, it'd be stressful for me now.
I know, for real.
So their marriage had intermittent periods of separation in which Corinne ended up moving out and taking the children with her. During that time, John became involved with entertainment wrestling as a hobby.
Okay.
He got into this circle of entertainment wrestlers, and he would work the circuit.
Like WWE, only probably something local.
Exactly. And he ended up earning like $30 a show. He had two wrestling personas. One was the bad guy, Damon Black, and the other was, quote, good old boy Johnny Wayne. Anyway, that's what he did for fun and to earn some extra money. During one of their periods of separation, a wrestling friend of John's ended up moving in with him to help defray living expenses. But the young couple, they were determined to work things out, if not for anything else other than the children. Corinne returned home with Natalie and Chase, but it wasn't long after that she began an illicit affair.
Oh, damn it. I knew you were going to say that.
With John's wrestling friend, which was eventually discovered by John. And that was the final straw for him. John left Corinne, and he ended up moving in with his parents, Richard and Ann. In the beginning, Corinne took custody of the children, but her life was very unstable. She had no job, and she had no money. And after John filed for divorce, she agreed to give him full legal and full physical custody of the children. She described John as a doting father. He referred to Natalie as his little princess, and Chase would follow him around like a little shadow.
Aww.
The divorce was final in June of 2009, and as I said, John was awarded primary custody of the children, and he and his children lived with his parents they helped him tremendously, as you can imagine, being the grandparents. They pretty much took on the whole role of mother, in essence. Although Corinne's circumstances were such that she couldn't provide for the children, she still had regular visitation every other weekend. And John was the one that really helped facilitate it. He wanted her to be a part of the children's lives. By all accounts, little Natalie and Chase were normal, happy children. The family nicknamed Natalie Princess. And as I said, Chase mimicked everything his father did. Medical records indicate they were regularly treated for all the expected childhood illnesses. Their shots were up to date. And I saw pictures of them that were posted by their family. There are millions of photos of them in different costumes, presents, just your typical happy American children. But all that changed when John started dating Heather Keaton. It was October of 2008 when the two met on some social media website. I don't know which one. Heather was originally from Louisville, Kentucky, and she was enrolled as an undergraduate student at Spring Hill College in Mobile. She ended up earning a scholarship to attend there where she was studying political science. Heather suffered from some sort of visual impairment that limited her eyesight, but she wasn't legally blind. And I don't know exactly what the visual impairment was, but it was enough where her vision was tremendously limited. After a few months of dating, Heather ended up going back home to her family in Louisville, Kentucky for some amount of time. But then she moved back to Mobile and ended up moving in with John's parents, along with John, 3-year-old Natalie, and 2-year-old Chase. And that's when those children's lives changed forever. Right away, Heather and John's mother, I'm going to call her Grandma Ann, began butting heads about the proper way to care for the children. Even though Heather had no experience whatsoever raising small children, she asserted the superior knowledge on child rearing, claiming she knew what was best for Natalie and Chase. She was domineering to the point that Jonathan's parents couldn't take it anymore, and they kicked her out after less than 2 months.
Wow.
Yeah, they were done. I mean, I'm just going to say it. Heather's just a bitch. She really is, as you will soon see.
Does she have kids of her own?
No.
Okay.
She had no children of her own, so she had no real experience raising children. But she was very arrogant. In all of our lives, there's this pivotal point, a time when we have made a decision that would later affect the entire course of our future. And when Heather was kicked out, that was John's decisive moment. This is when he chose to move out of his parents' home too, taking Chase and Natalie from really the only home they'd ever known, ripping them from their primary caregiver and their family that really loved them. Heather and John had no real place to go. They didn't have a lot of money, as I said before, and John had relied heavily on his parents' help. So in essence, they were homeless. Heather, John, Natalie, and Chase ended up crashing at Heather's friend Dana Mullen's house. That lasted for a few weeks, and they ended up going to a friend of John's, a wrestling friend named Robin Rios, and staying there with his wife, Heather Rios, and I'm just going to refer to her as Rios so we don't get the Heathers confused. And all of them were together with the Rios children. So there's a whole bunch of people in this small trailer. The Rios family quickly lived to regret inviting the couple to stay with them. Heather and John were constantly arguing. Heather wanted to move to Louisville and didn't want to live in Mobile, Alabama anymore. And she confided to Rios that she wanted nothing to do with raising Natalie and Chase.
Oh, no.
She didn't love them. She didn't even like them. They were nothing but a burden and a hindrance in her life. Heather complained that John desperately wanted his children and Heather to be one big, happy family, but she didn't want any part of that. She hated the children, especially Natalie. She was jealous of the attention John would give her.
How awful. You're jealous of a little girl and her relationship with her dad?
I know,
That's
it's
just
ridiculous. Sick. The contention of the couple couldn't be ignored in the Rios' small trailer, and they began feeling very uncomfortable in their own home. It wasn't just the constant battles between Heather and John that became too much for them. It was the way the couple treated Natalie and Chase that pushed the Rios to their limits. And they just told John and Heather they needed to leave. In the few weeks that Natalie and Chase had lived with the Rios, it was really Heather Rios that took care of them. She bathed them, she fed them, she included them in all the things she did with her own children, and she was a great mom. She would videotape the children playing, laughing. After Heather and John moved out, the Rios called Grandma Ann and told them they were extremely concerned for the well-being of Natalie and Chase. They didn't believe John and Heather could or would properly care for the children, and they hoped that somehow Grandma Ann and Grandpa Richard could intervene in the situation. But the grandparents couldn't. They didn't have any custodial rights of the children, and John ceased all communication with them. They'd been effectively cut out of their grandchildren's lives. They weren't even able to give Natalie and Chase their Christmas presents.
Aww.
And Chase's birthday was right after Christmas. Normally they would have a birthday party for him. But this year, Chase didn't have a third birthday party, and he didn't get any presents from his grandparents. Shortly after getting the phone call from the Rios, John called his parents. He told them that he'd made a mistake and he wanted to come home with the kids. He was going to leave Heather. He asked them for their car. He said he needed it to help move. But none of that was true. He really just intended on stealing their car. About the second week of January, and this is 2010, John, Heather, Natalie, and Chase visited John's friend Roger Champion, who was also an entertainment wrestler. Roger lived with his wife and children in a trailer in the Chanchula area of North Mobile County. No clue.
Sounds good to me.
The Champions were relocating to North Alabama, and they had this mobile home that was available, so they agreed to rent it out to John and Heather. And since John and Heather were homeless, they said, okay, you can move in right now, even though they were still living there. The night before the Champions, and I would love that last name.
That's awesome.
Who are you guys? We're the Champions.
We're the Champions.
The night before they were set to move, John came home with some hamburgers and french fries from McDonald's, and he gave some to Heather, and the two of them ate this, I'm sure, delicious meal. But the Champions noticed the only thing they got for Natalie and Chase was one small side salad to split between them.
Are you fucking kidding me?
No, and they are small, and they're just filled with iceberg lettuce.
And what kid wants a salad?
I know. Well, they did. They were starving.
Oh.
It's at this point where we know for a fact that Chase and Natalie were being starved. The next morning, Roger noticed that Chase and Natalie were sharing for breakfast just one small individual snack-sized box of cereal.
Oh, that's making me sad.
That's all they were given for breakfast, which was nothing compared to what the Champions fed their children. But that's all that Chase and Natalie were allowed to have, even though there was much more food in the house. Later that day, John helped Roger load the Champions' family's furniture into a moving truck. And as they were doing so, Roger could hear these horrible sounds of children screaming and crying. It wasn't the sound of a child whining, but of a child in tremendous fear and pain. It really rattled Roger enough to stop loading the truck and run inside the trailer to see what was going on. As he went to go inside the trailer, his wife ran outside. She was extremely upset, almost hysterical, as she was describing to him what she just witnessed. Heather had caught Natalie and Chase trying to eat a piece of Heather's chocolate pie that she left on the counter, and that just made Heather go completely ballistic. She was holding Natalie off the ground by her hair with one hand and beating her with a belt at the same time with the other hand. When 3-year-old Chase, who was still in diapers, tried to intervene, she knocked him down on the floor. This sort of quote-unquote discipline was completely unacceptable to Roger and his family. And Roger warned John that he better not let anything happen to those children or Roger would beat John's ass. John was clearly a weak man. It's obvious who wore the pants in his relationship with Heather. He explained that Heather was now in charge of disciplining his children. She had free reign to do whatever she deemed appropriate. And then he minimized the brutality by saying it was nothing more than a spanking. That day, Roger and his family moved all their personal belongings up north. And at the urging of Roger's wife, he reached out to John's parents. He expressed his concern that the children may be at risk of harm. They still seemed relatively okay. They weren't emaciated. They weren't like covered with scabs and bruises, but the behavior of Heather's made them worried for the children's future. Later on, Roger ended up speaking with a mutual wrestling friend of his and John's named Cretan Hobbs. Cretan managed John's wrestling gigs, and he was also friends with Natalie and Chase's mom, Corinne. Roger was talking to Cretan, and he said, I'm really concerned with the way Heather's treating Natalie and Chase. And Cretan was a little bit concerned himself because it was only a few weeks earlier when he attended a cookout at the Champions trailer in which Heather and John and Natalie and Chase were there, where he saw some behavior that was very concerning to him. He witnessed Heather screaming and cursing at Natalie and Chase, roughly grabbing Natalie by the arm and the shirt and yelling at her that she was, quote, like a demon spawned from hell. And she was at a cookout. Heather's at a cookout doing this.
What the fuck?
And she was screaming during all this in front of people just how horrible the children were. Cretan went up to Heather and he said, "You are completely out of line. If I see or hear that you do anything like this again, I will contact the police." A few weeks later, so now we're in February of 2010, Heather, John, and the children went and visited the Rios home for a birthday party for one of the Rios children. While they were there, Chase had diarrhea. He was dirty and he smelled really, really bad. He had rashes. So obviously he'd had diarrhea for a while. And Heather Rios was so concerned for the boy that she ended up giving him a bath and letting him soak in the tub and giving him clean clothes and a clean diaper. Both Natalie and Chase seemed to be desperate for food. They ate unusually large quantities of it while they were at the house. And Chase seemed so ill that the Rios advised John and Heather he should probably be taken to urgent care or call your family physician, do something. And John promised he would. He said that Chase didn't seem well. He blamed Natalie and Chase's poor physical condition on this diarrhea, this unknown virus that they must have had. After that birthday party, the Rios never saw 4-year-old Natalie again. Not long after that, Cretan Hobbs, per Roger Champion's request, went to check on the children at the Champion's trailer where Heather, John, Chase, and Natalie were renting out. He was surprised to see John crouched on the floor, holding his ribs and moaning in pain. Heather was also on the floor, visibly upset. They claimed that Grandma Ann and Grandpa Richard, along with John's Aunt Rose and her husband, forced themselves into the trailer, pushing open the door while Jonathan pressed against it. Jonathan lost control and the door swung open. It knocked him in the ribs and knocked Heather onto the floor. In a very agitated manner, Heather, while holding her belly, declared, quote, "I hope this baby dies." She was now pregnant.
Oh, no.
Fed up with being denied access to the grandchildren, Grandpa Richard and Grandma Ann deny that's how it all went down. They say that they were just really desperate to give Chase and Natalie their Christmas presents and Chase his birthday present. And when they found out where they were living, they knocked on the door. John was clearly surprised when he opened it, but he still allowed them to come in. He made it very obvious to everyone that he was very unhappy with their unannounced visit, but hesitantly, he agreed to let Chase and Natalie open their presents. When Heather heard commotion, she came storming into the living room from the back bedroom, shouting words to the effect of, quote, "What is that bitch doing here?"
Grandma Ann?
She's referring to Grandma Ann. To avoid a confrontation, Ann and Richard, they left the trailer and waited in the car. Rose and her husband watched the kids finish opening their gifts. That was the last time that Grandma Ann and Grandpa Richard ever saw either of their grandchildren. alive. And it was shortly after that Cretan Hobbs knocked on the door and saw John and Heather laying on the floor. What more than likely happened is that Heather and John got into a fight with each other. Either way, Cretan Hobbs agreed to take John to the emergency room because his ribs were hurting. And that's when they announced to him that Heather was indeed pregnant. While Heather and John were at the emergency room, Cretan took Natalie and Chase out to get something to eat. He was shocked by how hungry they seemed. It was almost as if they hadn't eaten in days. But later, Heather and John assured him that wasn't true. Soon after, the family moved once again. This would be the last time that Natalie and Chase would have a new residence. They moved into Unit 41 of Peach Place Apartments. There, a woman named Nicole Conniff, she was a manager. Nicole, along with other tenants, had observed Natalie and Chase outside the apartment, unattended, in the parking lot, which is right next to what was described as a high-traffic street. By now, they were 3 and 4 years old, but Chase is still wearing diapers. He just turned 3. The children were described as filthy, and Chase usually had a dirty, sagging diaper. As you can probably tell, Tanya, there are many opportunities where someone could have called and intervened in this matter, but no one ever did.
I wonder why.
I'm not sure.
Maybe it's the old, I don't want to get involved. I don't know. These poor children.
And I haven't even yet described what's going on behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
I'll get to that. It's really, really heartbreaking. The rental agreement at Peach Place allowed access to all the units by the manager for the purpose of pest control inspections. On one occasion, not long after moving in, manager Nicole, accompanied by a pest control inspector, went to John and Heather's apartment. After knocking several times and not getting a response, Nicole used her master key to enter the unit. Upon entering, she observed Natalie and Chase sitting on the floor, facing different walls of the living room of the small apartment. Heather came out of the bedroom and she was just screaming and cursing at the children for letting a stranger into the apartment. The children sat silently facing the wall, trying to be as still as they possibly could, but Nicole could see their little bodies were trembling.
Aww.
Nicole tried to calm Heather down by explaining that she'd used the master key to gain entry and it wasn't the children's fault. But Heather just kept screaming and yelling at the children and at Nicole. Throughout the next few weeks, the police were called to the Peach Place Apartments quite a few times, and none of it had anything to do with Heather and John. But John developed a paranoia about why the cops were there, and every time a cop showed up at this apartment complex, he would go to Nicole and ask her, "Why are they here? Why are they here?" It got to the point where Nicole said to him, "Are you hiding something?"
Right, seriously, why are you so worried?
But he never responded to her. He was definitely hiding something. But before I tell you what was going on behind closed doors, we're going to take a quick break. So now we're into the first week of March 2010. The Rios coincidentally ran into John at an area Walmart. While they were there, they asked him how the children were. And during the conversation, they learned that Chase was outside in the van with Heather. The Rios really wanted to see Chase, so they walked out to the parking lot and they approached the van. They were shocked by Chase's appearance. Through the window, they could see his eyes were sunken.
Oh.
He was pale. He appeared to be in a stupor, and he could barely hold his head up. He looked, quote, emergency room sick, end quote. They demanded John seek immediate medical attention for little Chase. And John did, sort of. He called an area medical clinic where Natalie and Chase had been treated in the past. And he spoke with someone there on the phone. He said he didn't want to come in, but he asked what they thought he should do to help treat Chase's diarrhea. But since John wouldn't bring the boy into the clinic, there's only so much they can tell him over the phone. They just suggested that he give him some Gatorade and keep an eye on him. That meeting at the Walmart was the last time the Rios ever saw Chase alive. They were so concerned by the way he looked that they called Child Protection to report their suspicion of abuse. But no one from that department ever followed up with them. If they had, it might have saved Chase. But it was already too late for Natalie. Now, during all this time, John was enrolled at Blue Cliff Career College in Mobile. While he was taking classes there, he met another student named Renee Pierce, and she was kind enough to give him a ride to school because he didn't have a car. He'd stolen his parents, but they took it back somehow. I don't know the whole story. Don't care. When Renee first started giving him the rides in August, he would talk about his children, referring to Natalie as his little princess and to Chase as his little flirts. But from January 14th to March 2nd, for reasons unknown, John quit going to school. Then he called Renee on March 3rd and he asked her if he could have a ride. So he was going back to school. When Renee picked him up, she noticed he was different. She said he was behaving weird. He was unclean and he was unkept. And through the next few months, his hygiene went from bad to worse. And eventually he ended up dropping out of college altogether. Now, on Father's Day, Cretan Hobbs called John's cell phone, wanting to check on the children. He asked him what Natalie and Chase were going to do with their dad that day. You know, what are you going to do with your kids? It's Father's Day. He also said he had some gifts from Corrine that he said he would give to the kids, so he asked if he could see them. John said he wasn't home at the moment, but when he got back, he promised he would call Cretan and he could come over. Little did Cretan know that while he was talking to John on the phone that day, John was out disposing of little Chase's body. And John never, ever contacted Cretan again. The day after Father's Day, Heather started going to class with John, which is really strange to me.
That's fucking weird.
That's weird. Renee Pierce was taking them, and she asked them, you know, who's taking care of the children? Because normally when John was at school, Heather was a primary caregiver.
Good eye, Renee. Good eye.
And sometimes Heather was left alone with him for 10, 12 hours. John and Heather lied and said a friend was watching the children. Heather came to school with John a few more times and often made conversation with Renee during the rides. Renee recalled one particular conversation that really stood out to her. Heather confided to Renee that she didn't want to be a mother to Natalie or Chase, and that someone needed to teach Natalie that she wasn't the little princess they called her. Heather referred to the children as the spawn of Satan. She then rubbed her pregnant belly and referred to her unborn child as, quote, the chosen one.
She's sick. Does it feel good to make a little girl feel like shit?
And not be a princess,
right.
Just like rain on her parade. Heather expressed concern that Natalie and Chase, they might end up being jealous of her baby. But that would be impossible because by that time, they were already both murdered. And it was only a little while after that John ceased going to college. John and Heather were evicted from Peach Place in July of 2010. They left Mobile briefly to live with Heather's grandma in Georgia. And then they moved to Louisville, Kentucky, where Heather's mother, her name was Helena, she lived with her fiancé, Jim. John and Heather lied to Helena and said that the DeBlase children were living with relatives in Las Vegas. Helena owned some rental property and she ended up renting it out to John and Heather. And the property was right next door. So Heather lived right next door to her mom. And another neighbor of theirs was a retired police officer. On August 25th, Heather gave birth to a little, perfectly healthy baby girl. But by then, as you can imagine, the couple's relationship was tanking.
No.
They fought all the time. It would only be a matter of 2 more months before the relationship completely imploded. And the truth of what happened to those innocent children was revealed. On November 14th, while John was leaving his new job at the Louisville Muhammad Ali Airport.
I didn't know they had an airport named after Muhammad Ali.
I did not know that either. John ran a stop sign, and that caught the attention of a police officer. Apparently, he had never registered his vehicle.
Whoops.
And he had other traffic violations. They must have been bad enough. He probably owed money. That he ended up getting jailed overnight. And the van he was driving was impounded. The next day, he got out of jail. And I'm not sure exactly how, but Heather's mom, Helena, overheard a partial conversation between John and Heather. They were arguing, and she heard Heather say, quote, "So you're going to be like that. You're not with me because you love me. You're with me because..." And then according to the court records, it just has ... So I don't know exactly what she heard. But Helena heard John reply, "I'll tell. I'll tell."
Oh.
Although Helena didn't hear the entire conversation, she heard enough to be alarmed. And I think she might have actually been on the phone with her daughter. I know she later contacted Heather and asked her, "What's going on?" And that's when Heather admitted that the children weren't in Vegas and that something bad had happened to Natalie in the spring and to Chase on Father's Day. Heather said she was afraid of John. She was afraid John might harm her. He'd been abusive, and that he might harm their new baby. Fearing her daughter was the victim of domestic violence and that the children may have been murdered, because Heather claimed to not know exactly what happened, the police were called. 2 officers showed up to do a welfare check on Heather and to see if she wanted to go to a domestic violence shelter. When they got there, they didn't see any sign of injury at all to Heather, and there was no indication of any struggle in the residence. Based on their experience, they thought John and Heather's reaction to their visit was somewhat unusual. Heather told them that she wanted to leave with them. She wanted to go to a domestic violence shelter. But when she did it, and when she started packing up and gathering her belongings, she moved really slow, and she was really calm. Almost like she was giving John time to talk her out of it. But John mostly sat quietly and stared out the window. Later that same day, Lieutenant Thompson, that was his name, he interviewed Heather regarding the missing children. Her response to his questions were long, they were rambling, and they were described as confusing at best. Generally, she portrayed herself as an innocent and handicapped victim. She was a victim of abuse by John, and because of her blindness, she couldn't really say for sure what happened to Natalie and Chase. Now, again, she's not totally blind, but when it's convenient,
she's totally
blind. She told the police that Natalie had a toxic odor on her breath. She lost control of her bodily functions, and she'd been throwing up black stuff. According to Heather, on March 4th, John had his massage therapy classes to attend at school. And prior to leaving at 8 a.m., he put a tarp down on the floor of one of their closets. And he placed Natalie in the closet. And then he locked the door. Hours went by, and Heather was alone with Chase and Natalie. And as Heather tried to check on Natalie, she wasn't responding to her through the door. Heather says she was so concerned she called John, and he said, "Listen, when I get home, I'll open up the closet door and I'll check on her." 14 hours after he left, John finally arrived back to the Peach Place apartments. Now keep in mind, this is all according to Heather. When he and Heather finally got around to opening the closet door, they realized that Natalie was dead. They dressed her in her red pajamas. And I'm not sure exactly why they put on her red pajamas. I'm guessing whatever she had on prior was soaked with urine and perhaps feces. And I'm sure that's why the tarp was laid down to be used to collect that, since she wasn't given an opportunity to go to the bathroom. After putting on her red pajamas, they put her in the back of their van, and they waited till it was dark before driving her to a rural location. Heather said she didn't know specifically where because she couldn't see. And then she and John opened the rear of the van. Together, they picked up Natalie's body, and they walked into some wooded area where they disposed of her. But Heather's statement is very self-serving, and it's far from the truth. Natalie's last day alive was much more torturous and much more cruel than what Heather described, as you'll soon find out. Heather then recalled to authorities what became of Chase. She stated that on June 20th, Chase was displaying the same symptoms as Natalie, that foul odor on his breath and vomiting some black substance. She said he eventually was unresponsive and died. Once he was dead, he was put in a garbage bag and placed in the back of the van, and his body was taken to an undisclosed location where he was dumped like trash. This wasn't Lieutenant Thompson's first rodeo with a psychopath. He knew Heather was lying to him. He knew she wasn't this naive victim as she wanted him to believe. And he said she seemed very calculating when it suited her. A warrant was issued for John's arrest, but he'd already hightailed it to Florida on foot.
On foot?
His van had been impounded.
Oh, shit. He's thumbing his way to Florida? He's thumbing his way to
Florida. He had a wrestling friend down there. I believe that his wrestling friend was a professional wrestler, but that's irrelevant. Because his van was impounded, they ended up being able to get a search warrant and search it. Inside it, they recovered pictures of Natalie and Chase, the children's stuffed animals, a duffel bag, and a container of antifreeze. Cadaver dogs alerted them to the scent of a dead body in the back of the interior area of the van. Before they knew where John was, he called Heather's phone and he left voicemails. With a search warrant, they were able to listen to these voicemails, and in them, John professes his love for Heather. He's crying. He's saying he's so sorry for the way things turned out and to give him a call. So obviously he doesn't know what's going on with her. The children's mother, Corrine, was contacted, and she advised that she hadn't seen or spoken to her children in over a year, and she had no knowledge where they were. The next day, detectives went to a woman's shelter to interview Heather, and that's when she decided she wasn't going to cooperate with anybody. As a result, she was subsequently arrested on charges of child abuse. And once she was arrested, she agreed to talk to him again. She gave them a long, rambling, self-serving response, just like she'd done before. She once again denied knowing how Natalie or Chase died. She said that she had morning sickness, and with her visual impairment, she didn't really know what was going on in that household. By that time, the police had already interviewed John's friends back in Mobile, Alabama, and they confronted Heather with statements from witnesses like the Champions and the Rios that Heather had been abusing the children. Heather aggressively denied it. She said that John's friends were conspiring against her for a variety of reasons. On December 2nd, John was arrested in Pace, Florida, and he willingly spoke with the police about the disappearance of Natalie and Chase. At first, he began with this incredible story. Are you ready for this?
Oh, boy.
He said that the children were kidnapped on Father's Day.
Stop it.
During broad daylight by two armed men wearing masks at a park. That story didn't last very long before he abandoned it, realizing that's just fucking stupid. When he found out that Heather had already admitted that the children were dead, he gave his account of the timeline of events. And his account ended up being more in line with the evidence investigators would soon uncover. This is what he said happened. And it's so sad that I'm getting a little teary-eyed right now. He said that before he left for school on March 4th, it was around 8 a.m., Heather bound Natalie's arms and legs with duct tape. She just wrapped her all up in duct tape so Natalie couldn't move any of her limbs. She was then placed in a black suitcase.
Oh, my God.
John claims the suitcase was open when he left and that he had eye contact with Natalie and she was alive. The binding with the tape and the placement in the suitcase was just Heather's form of discipline, meant to bring about a change in Natalie's, quote, bad attitude. Heather thought the years of being called princess by her family had spoiled Natalie, and she needed to be taught not to act like a princess.
God, she was obsessed.
I know, and this is John saying this. Now, the part of John's statement, specifically that the suitcase was open, doesn't make any sense. What would be the point of trying to torture a child by placing him or her in an open suitcase? That's a very self-serving statement that we'll soon find out is false. John says that he was absent from their Peach Place apartment for 14 hours, which we know is true. When he returned home, he was surprised to discover that Natalie was in the closet and that the suitcase she was in was now zipped shut.
Oh.
When he unzipped the suitcase, Natalie was lifeless and her body was cold. Her jaw was stiff and it was locked open, like something had been stuffed in her mouth. Now that something was a sock. Who put the sock in her mouth and then who duct taped it to her face and duct taped her face? That part we'll never really know the truth on. But Natalie was dead. That's when they dressed her in her red pajamas, which means they must have removed some of the duct tape. It has to be. John then said he placed his dead daughter in the back of their van. John, Heather, and little Chase then drove to the Citronelle area, don't know where that is, somewhere in Alabama, where they left Natalie's body in the woods. When asked why he didn't call 911 after finding Natalie dead, he said he loved Heather and he was afraid of losing her.
Oh, fuck you. Really?
Yeah, that's what he said.
What an asshole.
He didn't want to lose her. He didn't want to lose the child they were expecting together. And he didn't want to lose Chase. Chase's murder was equally as cruel as his sister's. According to John, Heather was frustrated with her efforts in trying to potty train the little boy. By June 19th, she'd reached her tipping point. Heather grabbed Chase, who was clad only in a diaper, and she tightly wound his arms and his hands to his legs with duct tape.
Oh my God.
Kind of like a mummy while he was standing. She then wrapped his legs together with more duct tape. So you have duct tape wrapped around his arms to his legs, and then you have his legs duct taped. While he's rigidly standing, he was then duct taped to a broom handle that went all the way up his whole body, effectively making him completely unable to move his arms, hands, legs, walk, anything. And then he was placed in the corner of the bedroom and wedged against the wall by a dresser. A tarp was put under his feet in case he wet through his diaper. John and Heather lay on a bed in that same room, just a few feet away from where the boy stood, and they went to sleep.
Are you fucking kidding me?
No. John said he had a hard time sleeping in the same room with Chase that way, so he had to take a sleeping pill to help him out.
Oh my God.
The next morning, that's Father's Day, John woke to find Chase still taped to the broom. But now, according to John, there was a sack in Chase's mouth, which he said wasn't there before, and that Chase's whole face was covered with duct tape except for a little area where his nostrils opened up. Chase was cold and stiff. At some point in the night, he died. Perhaps he vomited while his mouth was duct taped and asphyxiated on his vomit, because as you'll soon learn, he was being poisoned. Perhaps he succumbed to the months of starvation and malnutrition. Either way, Chase's body was put in the garbage bag and placed in a van. While they were driving around looking for a place to dump his body, they stopped at GameStop and they bought the Iron Man video game, with John commenting on how they could do whatever they wanted now because they didn't have any responsibilities.
Oh my God.
After buying the game, they dumped Chase's body and just left him there to rot. Now, after his arrest, this is a little bit strange. John is in Mobile Metro Jail, and he wrote a whole bunch of handwritten letters between December 8th and January 2nd. He wrote them in the presence of his cellmate, who was facing 2 counts of murder. There's a lot of theories as to why John wrote these letters and signed his name to them, as did his cellmate, who eventually turned him in to the police. Some think that it's because John was getting his ass kicked in jail, and he was, and that his cellmate, his name was Brandon, could protect him. Some argue that these letters were coerced. Whether they're an accurate account of what happened to the children, I can't say for sure. However, there's definitely some truth weaved in these letters, and here's kind of what they say. Heather gave John an ultimatum in January of 2010. She said he needed to choose between her or his children. He claims he was, quote, blinded by love and chose Heather and gave her full reign to do with his children as she deemed fit.
Why didn't he just give them to Grandma Ann?
I don't know.
She would have gladly taken them.
I have no idea. That's a very good question. In these letters, he wrote how the children were beaten with belts. They were often made to stand in corners for extended periods of time. They were given poison in their sippy cups to break their spirits. At times, they were burned with cigarettes, and candle wax was poured on Natalie as a form of punishment. In one of the letters, John says that he opened up the suitcase where Natalie was put, and she was still alive. He said to her, "Why won't you just listen to Heather?" And then he claimed he grabbed her, he held her in the air, and he choked her to death to stop her suffering and torture.
What?
I don't know. That's what he says. I don't think that's how she died. I think she was already dead. I feel like 14 hours of being inside a suitcase with my face duct taped.
Exactly.
And given the fact she was poisoned and constantly vomiting, I feel like that's how she probably died. And I'll tell you in a moment what the medical examiner says. But according to his letters, he says he choked her. He also says he choked Chase to death because he didn't want to see him suffer any longer.
No.
On December 8th, Operation Chase was undertaken in Van Cleve, Mississippi. 60 to 70 people were walking in parallel lines in a grid pattern across the search areas looking for the 3-year-old's remains. It wasn't long when one of the search members found scattered human remains in the woods located less than 20 yards from the roadway. Along with the human remains, there were multiple pieces of gray duct tape close to where the skull was located. They also found a white sock attached to the duct tape, pieces of garbage bag, and a diaper. There were blonde hairs found attached to the sticky side of the duct tape. And as I said, there were multiple pieces of duct tape scattered around. When investigators retaped the duct tape together, it formed the dimensions of a child's head. And as John had described, it was clear the duct tape would have covered Chase's entire face, except for a tiny area where his nose was allegedly exposed. The sock attached to the tape aligned in the location where Chase's mouth would be. So it matched up to the story from John, not Heather. There was evidence of animal activity, and there were 2 marks on the tape around the area of the eyes. The state used DNA from a tooth to identify the skeletal remains of Chase. A child Chase's age would usually have over 240 bones, but investigators only recovered 21 of his bones.
Oh.
A forensic anthropologist later ended up testifying that on the roof of Chase's eye orbit, there were porous bone, and this is usually diagnosed due to anemia, often the result of malnourishment. And it is a non-specific indicator of poor health. Basically, this is evidence Chase was starved. On December 11th, there was a search for Natalie's remains with 77 volunteers and 4 cadaver dogs. And this was in Alabama. They did a similar grid pattern as before, and they cleared the area. Again, like Chase, Natalie's remains were found close to the road. And it ended up that they dropped her close to the road because they didn't want to get lost in a pathway too deep. So they just kind of threw her very close to the road. Part of her skull and lower jaw were located underneath a log. Found near the remains were remnants of her red pajamas. Again, the state used a tooth to get the DNA to show that it was indeed Natalie. The search for Natalie only recovered 68 bones. And a forensic anthropologist later testified that Natalie encountered a period of growth disruption before she died. Both the femurs and the tibia bones showed what is called Harris lines. Those are lines of arrested growth that can be seen when they're x-rayed. Hair lines are usually the result of nutritional deficiencies, poisoning, psychological stress, or high fever. The exact cause of the children's death, obviously it couldn't be determined based on the limited amount of bones.
Could be suffocation, could be
asphyxiation,
right.
It could be poisoning. Now, while Heather was incarcerated, awaiting for her trial, because obviously both of these monsters are going to be tried for the children's death, she couldn't seem to keep her mouth shut to her fellow inmates. She admitted to others that both she and John were poisoning the children with antifreeze. He would measure out it in the morning and put it in their sippy cups, and together they would also lace the children's food with it. Heather claimed that they had one set of pots and pans for their own food and another set for the children's food. And I know that one of the dishes that was laced for the children was spaghetti. They put antifreeze in it. According to Heather, at first they would eat it because they didn't seem to know the difference. They didn't know they were being poisoned. And antifreeze is very sweet. So if you're putting it in something sweet, I've never had it, but it might not be that noticeable. However, as time progressed and the poisoning continued, the children realized there was something wrong with the food they were given, and they ended up refusing to eat it. But when they refused to eat it, they'd get punished. The couple experimented by dosing John's aunt's dog. It was a wiener dog, a dachshund, and seeing how long it would take to kill the dog.
Jeez, got the dog involved.
I don't know if the dog died. I don't have any more information. But the poisoning caused the children to urinate and defecate on themselves. And then, of course, there was that black vomit. Both John and Heather had trials. I've explained to you the crimes, and here's the consequences of it. Both were sentenced to death.
Good.
However, Heather's death sentence was overturned. I don't want to bore everybody with it, but some of her constitutional rights
technicality.
Yeah. But then she ended up being resentenced to death this year. So she's still on death row. She's the only person in Mobile, Alabama, the only female to ever be sentenced to death. John's parents, Grandpa Richard and Grandma Ann, they quit visiting John and they disowned John. And throughout the trial, his father even ended up testifying against him. And that is pretty much the end. Obviously, Corrine, their mother, she testified and she spoke. And it was very sad. She said she hoped that the children didn't hate her for abandoning them and that no one could blame her any more than she blames herself.
That is terrible. This story...
Those children were failed so many times.
Yes, so many times. I can't understand how people do this to children. Your own children, number one, and then to choose someone else over your children.
And what's strange about it is that, by all accounts, John was a doting father.
Until he got involved with her.
I know, it's very strange.
That's evil. That is
but there's
so
just
terrible.
No excuse how you could watch your child being tortured. And I really honestly can't even imagine what those poor children went through.
They went through hell.
In suitcases and duct taped and their dad just...
People are fucking sick.
Yeah. So anyway, that is a really sad story of Chase and Natalie DeBlase. I just felt it needed to be heard. If anybody thinks any child is in danger, just call Child Protective Services or whatever the department is near you. Call the police. It's anonymous, and it's better to be wrong than to miss an opportunity to save a child.
Right. Well, thanks, Talia.
I want to thank you guys all for taking the time to listen. If you haven't done so already, please hit the subscribe or follow button on your favorite app so you can get weekly notifications. In addition, check out our Apple channel on Apple Podcast. If you go there and you subscribe, you can get over 100 exclusive episodes, early releases, ad-free releases, mini releases, and access to our live episodes. You can get the same things by going to patreon.com/TNTcrimes, or you can check out our website, crimesandconsequences.com.
You can also find us on social media at Hardcore True Crime on Facebook and Instagram.
Yep.
And we have merch.
We have merchandise. Check it out. It's on our website. Oh my goodness. We spend way too much time together. Anything else?
I don't think so.
All right. Thank you guys so much. Don't kill each other.
Until our next episode.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye.